Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our AAA Town Hall, Asleep at the Wheel, the Dangers of Drowsy Driving. I'm Mary McGuire, Director of Public and Legislative Affairs at AAA Northeast, and I'm joined today by my co-moderator, Dan Goodman, Manager of Public Affairs at our AAA Northern New England Club in Portland, Maine. Hi, Dan.
Good morning, Mary.
Good to see you, and thanks for doing this with us. We really appreciate it. So, Dan, I think you and I would both agree that I think feeling tired behind the wheel is something we can all relate to at some point in our lives. And for me, during my 12 years at AAA Northeast, alerting motorists to the dangers of drowsy driving has been a real passion project, because for me, drowsy driving is personal. That's because when my son Alexander was 17 and a new driver, he fell asleep at the wheel and suffered a horrific crash. And I got that call in the middle of the night that every parent dreads. We had already been trying frantically to locate Alex when he didn't arrive home on time that October night. But we later learned that he was trapped so tightly in the wreckage of his pickup truck that he could not even reach his phone to answer our calls or to call for help. After a passerby noticed the crash in the dark and called for rescue, EMTs used 3 sets of the jaws of life to free Alex, who was miraculously alive because he was wearing his seatbelt and because he kept his cool while waiting trapped for 2 hours for help. No easy feat for anyone. Alex suffered a paralyzing injury but recovered fully within a year. You see him here on the football field. And since that awful night, he and I have spoken publicly and in the media many times about the dangers of driving tired, hoping to prevent the trauma our family endured from happening to others. As we rightfully should, we focus a lot of our energies in traffic safety on impaired and distracted driving. But drowsy driving, even though it's so common, so widespread, is often overlooked. So in the hopes of increasing awareness, Dan and I will discuss the dangers of driving tired and the importance of sleep with a distinguished panel of experts this morning. Jennifer Pearce knows the anguish and the impact caused by drowsy driving all too well. She lost her 18-year-old sister, Nicole Lee, in a drowsy driving crash in 2008 and started a Drowsy Driving Prevention Foundation and Scholarship Fund in her sister's name. Since Nikki's death, Jennifer's family has channeled their grief into advocacy, and Jen travels the country speaking about the dangers of driving tired. And by the way, Jennifer's having some technical issues this morning, so when she speaks, you will hear her voice, but you probably won't be able to see her face. Brian Tefft is the senior researcher for the Traffic Research Group at the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety. And during his 14+ years at the foundation, Brian has done extensive research and spoken widely on sleep and drowsy driving. Dr. Judy Owens is an internationally recognized authority on pediatric sleep. She is co-director of sleep medicine at Boston Children's Hospital and a professor in neurology at Harvard Medical School. She has written more than 175 articles on sleep. Judy has been offering her expertise to AAA audiences for many years, and she's also been a longtime friend of mine. So thank you for being here, and thank you to our first 3 panelists. Dan will now introduce our next 3 panelists. Dan, take it away.
Thank you, Mary. Corey Rateau is a 25-year veteran of the Arlington, Massachusetts Police Department, where he has worked since 2002 as a traffic safety officer. Officer Rateau has encountered drowsy drivers literally where the rubber meets the road. Daniel Sullivan has served for 5 years as the Assistant Director of Policy at the Massachusetts Department of Transportation on a range of emerging technology and policy challenges, including management of the Commonwealth's Autonomous Vehicle Testing Program. Dan will discuss how new technologies are helping keep drivers alert and awake behind the wheel. And finally, we welcome Jim Nichols. Jim is head of product, technology, and brand communication for Volvo cars in the United States of America. All right, so first off, I want to thank all the panelists for joining us today, as well as the attendees. This program is being recorded, and I also want to let all the attendees out there know that please feel free to type some questions in the chat box feature that you can see on your screen. We'll hopefully, we definitely will have time at the end for all of our great panelists to answer your questions, so start thinking. So we're going to begin with Jennifer. Jennifer, tragically, you know all too well what the problems around drowsy driving. So can you please share us your story with everyone about your sister Nicole?
Sure. I actually wrote something, so I will read that off for you. Late one evening, 5 honor students from Virginia Tech decided to drive to Snowshoe for a day of skiing, leaving early the next morning. They spent the day on diamond runs and after physically exerting themselves, got back in the car for a long trek. On the road somewhere in West Virginia, all the passengers fell asleep. So did the driver. The car left the road, hitting a tree. There were injuries all around, some of them quite serious, but the front passenger took the brunt of the damage. My baby sister laid on that cold, snowy road with a stranger holding her hand while she fought for life. Everyone in my family got calls, and we raced to the hospital hours away, but we all arrived too late. My sister died alone, far from home, and we never got to say goodbye. I can't tell you how much the loss of my sister has devastated my family. Truly, there are no words to describe it. I have tried. Unless you have suddenly lost a vibrant young child in your family, I don't believe you can comprehend it, no matter the words that I use. The loss has propelled me into a new role in life. Most of the time when I'm invited to speak at events, I give a 20-minute speech about the worst days of my life. I talk about that call and about the moment my family stands over Nicole's body in the hospital praying. I describe the viewing where my mother is drugged and my father stoically shakes hands for hours while having to stand feet from an open casket where my sister's dead body lays. It's seriously one of the most difficult things I've ever had to witness. I describe my mother begging and pleading to see her baby one more time before we bury her. I talk about the first Christmas and the first birthday after her death. My job is to try to convey to others the best of my ability the horrendous grief, misery, and pain that overwhelms you for years to come. The title some people use to describe this and what I do is victim advocate. Well, I'm just not a fan of that title, and let me tell you why. I can give a million speeches to the largest venues filled with people or be interviewed by the most popular media outlets, and I will not be able to bring my sister back. No amount of effort can fix the damage done. I cannot turn back time and put my family back together the way it was before that day. I can, however, make Nicole's death mean something. I can stand in front of a crowd of 2 on some college campus or be live streamed for a government conference for thousands. I can create a social media post to my friends and hope that they share it with theirs, or I can make the evening news cycle. Each time I can purposely tear open a wound to reveal the agony of grief beneath. I can break my own heart over and over again in front of whoever will listen. I want to make it clear, though, I don't do this for Nicole or my family, the victims of that crash. I do it for the audience. I do it for you and your family. I do it for the other families out there that you might ruin if you drive drowsy. I'm advocating for the living. I bear that raw emotion and pain publicly, most often, just like now, with tears streaming down my face, not for the audience's pity, but for their action, your action. When I give my speeches, I usually don't post pictures of my family or Nicole like we did today. I want those listening to think about the story I'm telling in terms of their own family. I want their images to fill their heads, my words to be what whispers in their ear when they're too tired to get behind the wheel. I want that to be what stops them from driving impaired by the lack of sleep. I hope this will lead them to not sentence their family or other families to a lifetime of sorrow and sadness and regret. My beautiful sister was a light in life. She was smart, funny, youthful, yet so mature. She was a beacon for so many others. She was a leader and popular, but not because she had the coolest clothes or because she ruled the school. She was well regarded because she was kind and put others before herself. I believe that she was taken early so that her death could propel the message that drowsy driving is deadly. She was no victim in life, and she's no victim in death. She and all the passengers in the car made a mistake. It cost her the most precious thing, her life. But she's an inspiration, and I hope that she'll be the inspiration in your life to never put others at risk of the same fate. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.
So difficult
Yeah,
for
thank
you
you.
to talk about, we know, and we're so sorry for your loss. But the work that you've been doing for so many years to bring this issue to the forefront is so much appreciated, and I'm sure you've saved lives through doing that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer. I'm so sorry for your loss. That was really, really powerful. My daughter just turned 1, and I can't even imagine the pain you're going through. That was very, very appreciative. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So on to our next speaker, Brian Tefft from the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety. Brian, can you tell us about some of the great research that's being done at the foundation around drowsy driving?
Sure, thank you, Dan. So thank you, Mary and Dan, for inviting me to speak to y'all today about the risks of drowsy driving. And thank you first, Jennifer, for reminding us all of how important this really, truly is, better than a researcher like me ever possibly could. So we don't have a ton of time today, so I'm just going to dive right in. You can go on to the next slide. So drowsy driving is caused by a number of different factors, but the biggie is sleep. We just don't sleep enough. This on the screen is a joint consensus statement from the American Academy of Sleep Medicine and the Sleep Research Society. And their panel of experts concluded that healthy adults should sleep 7 or more hours per night on a regular basis to promote optimal health. They go on to note that sleeping less than 7 hours per night is associated with all sorts of adverse health outcomes, right up to and including death. But most relevant for our purpose today, routinely not getting enough sleep has been associated with impaired performance, increased errors, and greater risk of accidents. And no, this is just for healthy adults. Our next speaker, Dr. Owens, will show teenagers and young adults need even more sleep than this 7 hours. So on to the next slide. How much sleep do Americans actually get? In a survey done every year by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, they asked hundreds of thousands of people across the country this question, and we find that about 2/3 of Americans, a little less than 2/3, report regularly sleeping at least 7 hours a night. But that leaves about 1/3 that don't. About 1/4 typically get about 6 hours of sleep. 7.5% say they usually get 5. And the ones I'm really most concerned about here, a few that look like a small number, but work out to millions and millions of drivers when you think about the 228 million drivers we have in this country. These work out to be astronomical numbers of people that report regularly getting 4 or even less than 4 hours of sleep a night on a regular basis. So we should be getting at least 7 hours of sleep a night. About 1/3 of Americans say they usually don't. What does this mean for traffic safety? So for more than a decade, the AAA Foundation has been conducting an annual survey of a representative sample of drivers all across the country to study public opinion about traffic safety issues. One question we ask every year is this one. The past 30 days, how often have you driven when you were so tired that you had a hard time keeping your eyes open? Ask yourself that. I realize this is a strange time with the pandemic and all, but if you've been driving less than usual in the past 30 days, just think in general, how often do you do that? When we ask the American public, we find that about 1/4 of all drivers out there report that in the past month, at least one time, they've driven when they were so tired they had a hard time keeping their eyes open. About 1 in 8 drivers report that they've done it more than once. And about 2%. Doesn't seem like a huge number in it when looking at it as a percentage, but 2% of our 228 million drivers, about 4.6 million drivers across the country report that they drive when they're so tired that they have a hard time keeping their eyes open fairly often or regularly. That's a scary number. So how dangerous is it to drive when we're sleep deprived? Go on the next slide. In 2015, the National Sleep Foundation looked at all of the published evidence that existed at the time, this was 5 years ago, and they convened a panel of experts, including myself, to review all of that evidence and put together a consensus statement about what the data showed. This is what that consensus statement was. Drivers who have slept for 2 hours or less in the preceding 24 hours are not fit to operate a motor vehicle. That was actually a pretty contentious statement for debate among the panel. There was clear evidence that people who slept 2 hours or less should not be driving. There was a lot of debate, though, about whether we should have used 3 hours or 4 hours or 5 hours in this statement, as a lot of evidence suggests that you really shouldn't be driving when you've slept for 4 or 5 hours. But at the time, the panel believed, based on the evidence that existed in 2015, 2 hours was the place they were comfortable drawing the line. But now we have some more evidence. In a study published 2 years ago in the journal Sleep, AAA Foundation researchers, including myself, compared the crash risk of drivers who have slept for 7 to 9 hours in the past 24 to drivers who got less sleep than the experts recommended. And this next slide shows what we found. So what we found was that compared to drivers who slept at least as much as the 7 to 9 hours recommended by experts, drivers who reported that in the past 24 hours they'd slept 6 hours to a little bit less than 7, their risk of causing a crash was increased by about 30%. Drivers who slept 5 to 6 hours, their crash risk was almost double that of a well-rested driver. Drivers who had slept for 4 to 5 hours, their crash risk was nearly triple. And drivers who had slept for less than 4 hours in the previous 24, their crash risk was about 15 times that of a well-rested driver. And I realize these are just a bunch of numbers, so I find it helpful to compare this to some other risk factors that we're more accustomed to thinking about and talking about. So on the next slide, I show how these crash risks compare to the risk associated with driving after drinking alcohol. So here we see that driving after getting 6 to less than 7 hours of sleep, that increases your risk of causing a crash about as much as a driver with a blood alcohol concentration of 0.03. There's not anywhere in the United States where that's per se illegal, but there's evidence that shows that your driving performance starts to suffer after even one drink, and that's what that shows. Your driving performance starts to suffer after you've slept an hour less than you usually do, or an hour less than you should as well. When we look at drivers who have slept for only 4 to 5 hours in the past 24, their crash risk is increased about as much as a driver who has a blood alcohol concentration of about 0.05. That is actually the legal limit in most Western countries across the globe, with a couple of exceptions, including of course the U.S. And as of a couple of years ago, that would actually be per se illegal in the state of Utah as well. Drivers who have slept for less than 4 hours, their crash risk is on par with that of a driver whose blood alcohol concentration is about 50% over the legal limit in all U.S. states. That's nothing to fool around with. I don't personally, in my social circle, I don't know anybody who would drive with a blood alcohol concentration of 0.12. We need to move the conversation publicly so you wouldn't drive after you slept less than 4 hours either. And what does this work out to in terms of crashes, injuries, and deaths on our roads? So when I give talks like this, I used to put up a slide showing how many crashes, injuries, and deaths the United States government officially attributed to drowsy driving. But I don't even show those numbers anymore. I see people writing them down, and I don't want people to write them down because we know those numbers are only the tip of the iceberg. So those statistics from the U.S. Department of Transportation, they'd have you believe only 1, 2, maybe 3% of all the crashes out there involve drowsiness as a contributing factor. But from the best research available from the AAA Foundation and from other experts around the country and around the world, we know it's more nearly about 10 times that. We've estimated that about 6 to 10% of all reported crashes nationwide, that works out to somewhere between 400,000 and 670,000 crashes across the country involve drowsy driving. About 13%, or nearly 21,000 crashes that result in really severe critical injuries that require somebody to be hospitalized. About 20,000 plus severe crashes every year involve drowsy driving. And we estimate that drowsiness from fatigue, sleep deprivation, driving for too long without a break, these factors cut short the lives of at least 5,500 people across the United States every year, and possibly more, possibly up to close to 7,000. Those are our best estimates, not the 1%, 2%, 3% that the DOT would have you believe, but again, more like 10 times those numbers. So a few take-home points. There's broad consensus from the top experts in the country and the world that healthy adults need at least 7 hours of sleep a night on a regular basis for all sorts of reasons, including to stay safe on the road. Too many people don't get enough sleep. Driving after you've slept less than 4 hours increases your risk of causing a crash as much as driving with a blood alcohol concentration well over the legal limit. That maims and kills people. We estimate that at least 5,500 lives are needlessly cut short every year, and quite possibly many more because somebody gets behind the wheel when they're too sleep deprived or too fatigued to drive safely.
All right, thank you so much, Brian. That was really fascinating research. And for those out there who aren't familiar with the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety, check it out. They do some just amazing work in the traffic safety, from distracted driving to impaired driving, sleep. I could go on and on about all the great stuff you guys are doing. So thank you so much, Brian. And to our next speaker, Dr. Owens. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Owens, I've seen you speak a few times. You're amazing. I'm really excited that you're joining us today. You're known as an expert in sleep. You've devoted your life to sleep and treating patients with sleep disorders. So Dr. Owens, can you give us your perspective on drowsy driving?
Absolutely. And really thank you so much, Mary and Dan, for inviting me to be part of this panel. Brian is a hard act to follow because he's so articulate and, really presents the data and the evidence to support the extremely powerful testimony that Jennifer gave. So this is, sorry about that. So, this is a great group of speakers, and I am going to focus right now on a population that I've been interested in for quite a while now, and that's adolescent drivers, who I think are, all of the risk factors that Brian talked about, I think are really significantly increased in this population, because you're also adding in an inexperienced driver and some issues perhaps with impulse control. So it's really a perfect storm kind of scenario when we're talking about teens at risk. We can have the next slide, please. So I want to emphasize, and hopefully I don't sound too much like a talking head, but I want to really emphasize this concept of deficient sleep, because as Brian pointed out, we do know a lot about sleep amounts. How much sleep you get is absolutely critical in terms of causing impairments in attention and vigilance and reaction time and all those things that translate into an increased risk for drowsy driving. But what we don't oftentimes think about is that it's not just not getting enough sleep for your sleep needs, but it's also what's called circadian misalignment, which essentially, it's a fancy term for a mismatch between your underlying biological brain-based circadian rhythms and what the environment is demanding. Now, these things are often interrelated, but they both contribute significantly to behavioral and cognitive impairments and poor health outcomes. So bottom line here is, in other words, it's not just how much you sleep, but when you sleep and whether that aligns with your circadian rhythms. That's really critical. And hopefully I'll illustrate that a little bit more as we go along. Next slide, please. So deficient sleep, next one, previous one, please. Previous slide. Next one. Okay, well, we skipped one here, but that's all right. There we go, perfect. So what does this mean? What is this concept of deficient sleep? How does it play out in the real world? Well, it affects cognitive function, particularly what we call executive functions. And that's decision making, problem solving, planning, organization. And you can imagine how much that plays into your ability to safely be the driver, be behind the wheel. It affects attention, it affects memory, learning of new tasks, emotional regulation, and particularly risk-taking behaviors. So individuals who experience deficient sleep take more risks because they perceive less in the way of negative consequences for taking those risks. And that is so critical, because the decision to get behind the wheel when you haven't slept enough and you're tired and you're exhausted can be further compromised by being tired and exhausted. So next slide, please. So Brian presented some elegant statistics about drowsy driving, but we know that it's the young drivers who seem to be involved in at least 50%. And I totally agree with Brian that drowsy driving accidents are way underreported, and there's no breathalyzer test for drowsy driving, right? And unfortunately, because the driver does not attempt to avoid the accident because they're asleep, the issue of fatality is very real. So we simply don't have accurate statistics about that. Nonetheless, we did a survey of high school drivers in Fairfax County, Virginia, which is one of the largest school districts in the country. 183,000 students. And at that time, their school start time was 7:20. Almost 50% reported drowsy driving, and the prevalence was significantly higher in those students who are getting less than 7 hours. So we're talking about a cut point here that is significantly higher in terms of risk versus higher risk versus less risk than it is in adults regarding sleep duration. And there's also some evidence to suggest that there may be an increased risk in minority populations. Brian spoke eloquently about the association of impairments related to sleep loss and compared to those with alcohol intoxication. And what I say to parents is, there is no way you would allow your adolescent to get behind the wheel having knowingly consumed 3 or 4 beers. You would not give them those keys. But yet the level of impairment that we see in these students, these high school drivers, is equivalent to that. Not only that, but data from the CDC has suggested that there are other risk behaviors which can further exacerbate the risk for drowsy driving and crashes. Use of seatbelts. Mary, described how her son's life was saved by having a seatbelt, but students who are getting less sleep are less likely to use seatbelts. They're less likely to use bicycle helmets. They're more likely to be distracted drivers, and they're more likely to take the risk of drinking and driving. So that adds to the risks associated with drowsy driving and magnifies them significantly. Could I have the next slide, please? And this illustrates the time of day of teen crashes. And as you might imagine, there's a peak in the morning when students are driving themselves to school, and there's a peak in the afternoon when they're coming back from school. Interestingly enough, you would kind of anticipate that the crashes might be worse in the evening hours, and that doesn't necessarily seem to be true. And you can see in the second graph here, the difference between time of day crashes in the summer versus the school year. Personally, I would be really interested to see whether the pandemic, had an effect on drowsy driving crashes in teens because they weren't driving at those critical risk periods. So there's a research project for you. Next slide, please. So just to put my 2 cents in about a related issue that I'm very passionate about, and I was the lead author on the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations in 2014 about healthy school start times. And the recommendation was to delay school start times until 8:30 or later for all middle and high school students. Next slide, please. Now, what do we know about what happens when you do delay school start times? Well, there was a study that's now over 10 years old in Kentucky, in which one district changed their school start time from 7:30 to 8:40, and the percent of teens involved in car crashes went down by 16% in that district, compared with an increase of 9% in the rest of the state. There was a study in Virginia, 2 studies in Virginia, that looked at adolescent crash rates in 2 very similar counties in Virginia, one of which started at 7:20 high school start time and the other at 8:40, and found a 40% higher crash risk in the earlier starting high school. A study published by the CDC in 2014 showed a reduction in crash rates in 16 to 18-year-olds by as much as 65 to 70% in certain states. Now, as a public health person, I can't think of another measure that would have that big a bang for the buck. And we recently published just this year a study in Fairfax County, Virginia, that compared crash rates in Fairfax County in the 2 years before a school start time change, from 7:20 to 8:10, and the 2 years after the change, and found a significant decrease in crash rates in Fairfax County compared to an increase in the rest of the state, which amounted to approximately 126 fewer crashes in Fairfax County, Virginia. Next slide. And just to leave you with, another tragic story, it's not just the driver that can be affected. This was a terrible story of a high school senior who killed the superintendent of her school, driving to school at 6 a.m. She was talking on her cell phone, and she also left the scene of the accident. 2 very bad decisions, right? And, I emphasized at the beginning that sleep deprivation, deficient sleep, affects decision making. And this was a really tragic situation that is going to have long-term repercussions on the whole community. So things to keep in mind when you're thinking about letting your teenager get behind the wheel when they haven't slept enough. Thank you.
Judy, thank you. Great advice. Great advice to talk to your teens. I know that I always talk to Alex about drunk driving, about texting. I never realized what a tired teenager he was, and I think that's the case for so many teenagers. So thank you for sharing all of that great information with us. We now want to get the law enforcement perspective on drowsy driving. Officer Rateau, you've been dealing with drowsy drivers on the road for 25 years now. Tell us what you've seen and what advice you have for drivers who are feeling tired behind the wheel.
Thank you very much, Mary. I actually have a kind of a statement written out that I'm just going to read from. As she mentioned, I'm Officer Rateau, and I currently work in the Arlington, Massachusetts Police Department in many different capacities, but my main duties involve being a traffic officer and also a safety officer. Pretty much traffic enforcement has been my whole forte my entire career since I started in 1995, which eventually in 97 I was in the motorcycle unit, and eventually they created a traffic unit around 2002. Through all this, I learned that traffic enforcement wasn't solely about, handing out money fines to drivers who run afoul of motor vehicle laws, that you also needed to incorporate education if you wanted to create a safe commuting environment. And that's where the safety officer part of my job comes into play. When I assumed those duties, I learned this position served as a liaison between the police department and various town officials and other departments like the select board, town manager, DPW, and legal department to address general traffic safety concerns around town and proactively try to make all modes of transportation through Arlington equally safe. And with that, we can't have a safe driving environment if we don't identify and address matters such as drowsy driving. Drowsy driving is something that affects every community. Over the years, I've responded to many incidents that were the result of drowsy driving. And unfortunately, the vast majority of them were already after some sort of crash occurred, usually involving both injury and property damage. I was going to say, I remember my first drowsy driving crash. I was only on for a couple of years, and I still used to work overnights back then. I was a couple hours into my shift, and a call came out for a rollover crash with injuries on Concord Turnpike. Concord Turnpike is the access road to Route 2 and has steep embankments in some areas between the highway and the access road. The vehicle veered off the highway near the Dow Ave exit, rolled as it traveled along the embankment, and was resting on its roof by the time all emergency personnel arrived. Prior to being transported to hospital, a young female driver stated she had gotten off work and was heading home, was tired and fell asleep. And this was only the first of many crashes where drowsiness was a contributing factor. For me, the most recent one wasn't my own crash, but it was assisting the state police a couple of years ago with an investigation where a car, again on Route 2, late one night, left the roadway. This one went over the guardrail, went airborne and down the embankment, and came to rest just outside of a resident's backyard. And I helped out because that resident actually had security cameras in their backyard, and the whole crash was recorded. So I helped them with getting that footage to help with their investigation. And according to State Trooper, fatigue was allegedly a factor in that crash as well. And I gotta be honest, there may have been many others crashes that I've investigated where drowsiness could have been a factor, but not everyone admits to it for fear that, the repercussions of saying that they fell asleep while they were driving. And along with that, NHTSA, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, estimates that there are about 100,000 crashes annually that are due to drowsy driving. And they think the numbers, as everyone else in the panel has said before, are probably higher, just that it's tough to attribute and it's probably being underreported. So for the police perspective, and to address drowsy driving, we have to define it. And again, according to NHTSA, they say it's not just falling asleep at the wheel, it's profound impairment that mimics alcohol-impaired driving in many ways. Drowsiness leads to slower reaction times and impaired attention, mental processing, judgment, and decision-making. Drowsiness can occur from accumulating sleep debt, typically less than 6 hours a night over multiple nights, or from one night of not sleeping, as we've heard the other panelists mention earlier. And while drowsy driving can mimic a lot of the effects of drunk driving, we can find that it's also an exacerbating factor. As we all know, alcohol is a central nervous system depressant, and that's why it affects your cognitive abilities behind the wheel. But with being so, it can also make you tired. So on its own, drowsy driving is bad. But again, if you combine drowsy driving and alcohol, which we often can find is a result of drinking too much, you literally have a deadly cocktail.
Thank you, Corey. And I think that's such a great point that so many drowsy drivers are tired, and it's often underreported because there are other things going on in the car, distraction, alcohol impairment of some kind.
Yes, definitely. And, we know that drowsy driving and intoxicated driving leads to crashes that can result in serious injury or death. And some people may get lucky because, like the two cases I cited, they weren't serious injury, but not everyone fares so well. And I know we have someone from the Foundation for Traffic Safety here with us today, Brian, and I know that I've read past reports where they estimate, approximately 7% of all crashes are a result of drowsy driving. 16.5% of all fatals. Drowsy driving could be a factor in that. And with that data, that suggests that there's thousands of people who die every year as a result of drowsy driving incidents. And so as I'm winding down my part, I want to start explaining to you some of the things that me as a crash investigator or other police officers might be looking at, because we call them crashes because they just don't happen by accident. There's always a reason behind why a crash might happen. So these are some of the things that we look for when we're investigating a crash and to see if drowsy driving might be a factor in it. First, we would look at, if it's not a crash, what led to you being pulled over? Again, drowsy driving can mimic a lot of the same signs that a drunk driver may have. So you might be weaving in a road or something like that. So that could lead you to be pulled over, marked lane violation. You might hit something else, which would be a crash or something. So once we come in contact with you, then we got to decide, was it drowsy driving? If it was a crash, was it a result of drowsy driving or something else? So we may be looking at if alcohol was a factor. If we don't smell alcohol on your breath, drowsy driving could be something that could be a factor in the crash or why we pulled you over. Or maybe medication that you're taking could combine, and that can make you drowsy as well. Other things that we might look at if it was a crash is like the time of day. I believe Dr. Owens talked way better about circadian rhythms than I could ever say. But again, a lot of these crashes, they can happen either overnight, and a lot of people might be shocked to find that they happen in the middle of the day, as she mentioned earlier. Those are times where that rhythm might affect you and you might be drowsy. We also try to look at things like what you were doing prior to the crash. If you were coming from work, a lot of people do shift work, myself included. It can be kind of tough. Or I should say, I used to do shift work. Now I'm lucky enough to work kind of a regular schedule, but things like that can affect you. What kind of work you do, if it's strenuous, physical, or even mentally demanding on you, how long you were working, how much sleep you had that day, how much sleep you had the previous few days, because as we learned, it's not just one time. It can be over several days that you're getting a lack of sleep. What did you do after you left work? Did you start driving immediately? Did you try to take a break? Are there any medications that you're on that can make you drowsy? All those things we look at to try and determine whether drowsy driving is a factor in a crash. And before I go, for all of you people out there, I want to say some of the things you can do to prevent drowsy driving is, first and foremost, know the signs of it. If you're yawning or your head's bobbing, a lot of us has been there, that might be a sign that you're too tired to drive. Or we have rumble strips along the highway. You start hearing yourself driving over a rumble strip, you're leaving the roadway. That could be a sign that, again, intoxication, or that you might be too drowsy if you weren't drinking. We all have been on that autopilot when we're just driving along the road, and the next thing you know, we're 5 miles down the road and we don't even know where we are. And that could be a sign that you're drowsy because you're not paying attention to what you're doing. You miss your exit, not hitting rumble strip, but just leaving your lane in general. And just don't let a crash be the reason that you find out that you're too tired that you're driving, whether it's into another car, an object, but especially another person. At that point, it becomes too late. So just try to make sure you get some rest. They used to have the signs on highways say, take a break, stay awake for safety's sake. Drive at times when you know you normally are awake and well rested. Don't rely on caffeine. It might be a quick fix, but you still have these things called micro naps that you might take even after drinking, and it's not going to be your sole, savior in that. Don't take medications that make you drowsy, or even if you're taking a new medication that you don't know how it affects your body yet, don't get behind the wheel immediately after that. Of course, don't drink and drive. And in this day and age, you have so many options. If you can't just take a nap for a while, try calling a friend, a cab, or some sort of rideshare company so that we have everyone on the roadway safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Corey, and great advice for prevention, because that's what it's all about, prevention. And you're so right. When my son woke up, he was taking down the reflectors on the right-hand side of the road. So many of those things certainly apply to his crash and his situation. And Jennifer Pearce, I'd like to welcome you to the screen. And thank you again for telling us your story about Nicole Lee. So we now want to turn to the technology elements of the prevention of drowsy driving. Dan Sullivan and Jim Nichols are both joining us for that technology perspective. Dan, we'll start with you. You're an expert on autonomous vehicles. What kind of new technologies are we seeing that are designed to eliminate some of the human error that normally causes crashes and aims to keep drivers awake and alert?
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate being here, and thank you, Dan, also for inviting me to participate. I can't admit to being an expert on autonomous vehicles. I think most folks will tell you, if anybody you meet tells you they're an expert on autonomous vehicles, then they just really don't understand the things that they don't really know about. But I've gotten to work on a couple different pieces of this kind of industry. And I appreciate the opportunity to kind of speak about them. And before I get started, I just want to, again, echo the other sentiments and thanking Jennifer for sharing your family's story and your advocacy on this issue. I think it's really important and powerful. In my work at MassDOT, I've had the privilege of coordinating our efforts on automated vehicle technologies. And on the screen in front of you are a couple of different types of automated vehicle technologies that are either on the roads today or we expect will be on the roads in the next couple of years. So I wanted to share some perspectives about the intersection of automated driving technologies and driver attention and engagement to those driving tasks. And while it's generally accepted that automated vehicles will improve travel safety for most or all road users, it's also clear that these technologies are going to introduce some new risks in driving conditions that we just haven't really encountered before. So to start, I want to just really quickly go through a couple different types of automated vehicle technologies and the form factors. So in the left-hand column of this slide, you'll see personal vehicles the individuals may own now or in the next couple of years. ADAS is Advanced Driver Assistance Systems, and these are things like lane keeping assistance, dynamic cruise control, where it's modulating the speed based on the cars in front of you. The human driver in these vehicles and ADAS-equipped vehicles are responsible for much of the driving tasks. In the second type of a personal vehicle that has conditional automation, the human driver is still responsible for taking over some of the driving tasks immediately if necessary, but for the most part, the vehicle does a lot of the driving work. The middle column actually shows two different types of highly automated transit type vehicles, some of which are already kind of on the roads in different cities and states around the U.S. today. The first is a low-speed shuttle, and the second is kind of like a robo-taxi type of vehicle. These highly automated vehicles, when they're deployed, don't require a human to be behind the wheel, but they may be only operated in kind of well-defined or limited sets of roads and in limited weather conditions. And the right-hand column shows commercial vehicle types, starting with trucks that are equipped with driver assistance systems like lane keeping and dynamic cruise control, again, where the human does most of the work. The second type of commercial vehicle is conditional automation for trucks, again, similar to private passenger vehicle, where the truck may do most of the work, but the driver is still there and needs to be attentive and ready to take over the driving task kind of immediately as necessary. And then the last part of the commercial driver assistance and automated vehicle technologies is a highly automated truck. We expect maybe operated on some limited highways over the next couple of years or decade, where you really don't need a human kind of behind the wheel, but the truck actually can do all of the driving between a certain sets of points. And I'm glad we have Jim here from Volvo, because I know they're making innovations in this whole range from the passenger vehicles through the commercial truck type. So I'm excited to hear about what Volvo is working on. Mark, if you could go to the next, I'm sorry, sorry, update on my computer. So some of these vehicles are ones that require a human driver to interact with an automated driving system. And in these environments, we really need to make sure that the driver is adequately paying attention and engaged in the driving tasks so that they are conducting whatever parts of the driving tasks are necessary for them. It's really, one of the things that we've seen is that when the system automates some of the driving tasks, the human driver may lose attentiveness to their roles and responsibilities, and they may not conduct the necessary parts of the driving tasks, and in turn may get distracted more easily, tired, or fall asleep, because they're not so engaged with the driving tasks. And we've seen this already happen in a couple of vehicles that have advanced driver assistance systems that combine lane keeping and dynamic cruise control. Tesla is one of the prominent automakers that makes a system like this, and they call theirs autopilot. And when using these systems, drivers can become, over-reliant on them, and may perhaps, become more easily tired or drowsy. We've seen a couple of these examples, over the past year or two. And in particular, we had one incident here in Massachusetts where a driver was spotted driving down the Massachusetts Turnpike, apparently, asleep at the wheel, as you can see in that first picture. While Tesla says that autopilot requires active driver supervision and that autopilot doesn't actually make the vehicle autonomous, its systems really don't seem to, at current, provide adequate prevention for a driver, sleeping behind the wheel. The main way that Tesla tries to determine if a driver is paying attention is through a torque sensor in the steering wheel. So if the driver's hands are on the steering wheel, the system will feel the force that's exerted from their hands, and it will detect that their hands are indeed on the wheel or not. But this system seems alone inadequate to prevent drivers from falling asleep behind the wheel. And in fact, videos from Tesla's own website, as you can see in that middle picture, show a driver using autopilot without their hands on the wheel, which, like the term autopilot, can really mislead operators into thinking the vehicle can do more than it's really designed or capable of, at the present time. And on the next slide, within the auto industry, the term driver monitoring system is what is used to describe these range of technologies that can really measure a human's interaction and engagement with the driving tasks. These driver monitoring systems include steering wheel torque sensors, like I mentioned, in addition to driver-facing cameras that can detect eye tracking and facial movement, heart rate monitoring, or other biological or automotive indicators. And these systems are really critical for automated vehicle technologies to help understand, if a driver is sufficiently engaged in their piece of the driving tasks. In an automated vehicle, if the driver is determined to not be engaged or attentive, the system really needs to be able to take over or mitigate that situation or get the driver back engaged. But these driver monitoring systems can actually be extremely helpful in improving safety for non-automated vehicles as well. And they don't have to come built into a vehicle. There are many aftermarket solutions where you can kind of plug and play, into a current vehicle. And then on the next slide, I just really want to quickly touch on how Massachusetts and the states in the Northeast are really collaborating around automated vehicles, automated driving systems generally. So the first is a research project that's underway to define existing laws, regulations, and policies that could impact the operation of these connected and automated vehicles on roads today. And this is really just a demonstration of the collaboration that the Northeast states have had over the past several years, and this research element is just one piece of that. And the second piece I want to mention quickly is that MassDOT, we are trying to get a better understanding of these advanced driver assistance systems, lane keeping and dynamic cruise control, to understand how drivers are using them, how much they know about these systems, how they are using and misusing them, and then really how we can help better educate the general public and drivers when they're going through driver training on the use of these systems. So that's just some of the stuff that is going on in Massachusetts and in the region. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and share some of that.
Thanks so much, Dan, and we appreciate that regional information for sure. Jim Nichols, safety has long been a calling card for Volvo. I drove a Volvo wagon for many years, loved it. And I should also mention that the Volvo S90 hybrid plug-in sedan scored highest and got top honors in the 2020 AAA Car Guide, so congratulations. Tell us what types of technologies Volvo is making available to keep drivers awake and alert on the road.
Thank you. Yes, our vision is that no one should be killed or seriously injured in a new Volvo. That started in 1959 with the invention of the three-point safety belt, which is in every car today, to the development of side curtain airbags, rear-facing child seats, and kind of the list goes on. And in order to get us closer to that vision, we set out since the 1970s of studying every accident that was within a 200-mile radius of our headquarters in Sweden. And as a result of that, we've wound up with one of the largest databases of causality as it comes to serious injuries and fatalities when it comes to accidents. And when speaking specifically about drowsy driving, I think it should be noted that it's not just an American problem, it's not just a New England problem, it's a global problem. And as a result of this research that we've done, since 2007, we've developed what we've called a drowsy driver detection system that's been standard in our cars since 2007. So a lot of the technology that Dan had alluded to, which is the autonomous drive, the self-driving technology, of course, is very important, and I could go on for hours about that. When we look at technology that's available today, in 2007, what we did is actually the effort of putting people in a very controlled environment in a vehicle to study what happens to driving behavior as people start to fall asleep. We were able to take that information and essentially develop algorithms where without, at that time, not available technology, which was driver monitoring with cameras, we were able to determine whether someone was driving impaired or whether they were driving starting to fall asleep. Just by the sudden change in the driving habits. You heard some of it earlier in this talk, whether it be starting to drift off the roadway, whether it's sudden changes or delays in steering inputs, whether it's changes and delays in braking inputs and things like that. And really the focus there is obviously there's a great deal of education that needs to be done in letting people know when is a safe time to be behind the wheel and when is not. But from a manufacturer standpoint, and specifically from Volvo's standpoint, we have to meet people where they are. And right now, people still are very overconfident in their abilities, particularly when they are drowsy. People seem to think that they can just muddle through it, tough through it, and then it'll be fine. So it's up to us as an automaker to develop the systems that are in place to try to combat that. And that shows up in numerous ways, whether that be assisting with steering input, whether that be assisting in braking input, because we know that drivers don't have the tendency to put the proper steering force or the braking force in the event of preventing a crash. So, and we also have to look at how we approach warning people about the potential dangers. So rather than having something that pops up on the screen that's fairly judgmental, saying you're too drowsy to drive or whatever, we just simply pop up on the dash with an alert that has a picture of a coffee cup, and it simply just asks the question, is it time for a break? And we find that when you approach people in that way, is it, do you think maybe it's time for a break? Usually that's when people will start to self-reflect and say, you know what, maybe that's a good idea. Pull over to the side of the road, go get a cup of coffee, take a few minutes to relax and try to regain your faculties. Of course, we have that awareness technology, but there's also technologies that are in cars today, which we do make standard as well, to simply identify the edge of the roadway. And we talked about the ADAS systems earlier from Dan, but looking at these systems to not only keep you within your lane, but of course, not every road has proper lane markings. So actually using systems to determine where the edge of the roadway is and attempt to keep the driver on the pavement and to prevent them from going off the road. Because what our research has shown us is that the most common fatalities and the most common areas for serious injuries, specifically spinal injuries, is usually single vehicle accidents where the car leaves the roadway. So a lot of the technology that we've developed, of course, is to notify the driver where the car has detected that there's been a change in behavior, but also do the best that we can to keep the vehicle on the roadway surface. And of course, then the multitude of other systems that start to kick in to not only keep the driver safe, but also make them aware that maybe they shouldn't be driving at the moment. So these are what we've been working on for several years, and these are technologies that are available today. And then, of course, what we've spoken or what we've heard from Dan regarding the future of autonomous driving is we continue to improve upon automated systems where the driver's input is less necessary. The one important point, though, that he did point out is what is often referred to as level 3 driving, where the driver is sometimes in charge and the car is sometimes in charge of the driving environment. We as a company have decided that we are going to skip level 3 because there just should never be any ambiguity as to when the driver is in charge of the driving environment. It's the same way that, you can't be a little bit pregnant. Either you're in charge of driving or you're not in charge of driving. And we're approaching autonomous driving with that in mind, of either the car is completely in charge of everything that occurs in the driving environment, and it's very evident that that is the case, or the driver is completely in charge of the driving environment. Because no matter how much technology we develop, no matter how many features we put in the car, both active and safety features, the best safety feature is still an alert, skilled driver that is behind the wheel. And until we get to that level of even level 5, which is no steering wheel at all, where there's no chance for a driver input, the driver still has a very important role in the driving experience. And we, of course, want to make all the systems and safeties to assist in keeping that as safe as possible. But making sure that you have a well-rested, well-educated driver is still one of the most important aspects.
Well, certainly agree with that. And you've raised some great points, and we actually already have a couple of questions for you, Jim. And we are going to extend this program to about 12:15 because we have a number of audience questions, which is great. Thank you, Jim. Thank you to all of our panelists. You're going to have a chance to chat again when you answer these questions, and Dan will be directing those questions to you. In the meantime, we'd like to do a very quick audience poll and get our audience involved in this discussion. And we have a poll question, which hopefully we will now see on the screen, and yes, we do. And our question is, in the past year, have you fallen asleep or had trouble keeping your eyes open while behind the wheel? So go ahead and fill in your answers to that question. Again, we're talking about the past year. I think most people have had an experience at some point in their lives where they have fallen asleep at the wheel or certainly had heavy eyelids at the wheel. And I am seeing the poll results now. So again, we are seeing that this is a widespread problem, drowsy driving. So 56% of those of you who responded out there say that yes, in the past year, you have fallen asleep or had trouble keeping your eyes open while behind the wheel. So, again, we want to see that percentage shrink, right? By taking some of those preventive steps that Officer Rateau talked about, and by thinking about all of the great points that have been raised today about taking this issue seriously. So Dan, I'm going to throw it over to you because I know we have some audience questions. So why don't you take it away with those questions? I'm sorry, Judy, did you want to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, I could. I just want to raise one point quickly that I don't think has been discussed, and that is sleep disorders, which can significantly contribute to the risk of drowsy driving, probably the most important of which is obstructive sleep apnea. And we know that adequate treatment of first of all, diagnosis of obstructive sleep apnea and adequate treatment significantly reduces the potential for drowsy driving. And this is an issue that, is particularly concerning in truck drivers, for example, who have a very high prevalence of obstructive sleep apnea. So those of you who aren't diagnosed, get diagnosed, and those of you who don't use your CPAP, use your CPAP, because it's really going to help a lot in terms of preventing a tragedy.
That's great practical advice, Judy. Thank you so much for raising that point. Dan, do you want to share some of the questions we're getting from our audience?
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, some great questions. The first one, and I think this one is going to you, Brian, and then I was also thinking that maybe Officer Rateau, you could maybe follow up with some with this as well. So the question is, Brian, you talked a lot about some of the NHTSA and DOT crash numbers around drowsy driving, and so is the issue with the numbers you can't measure the crashes, that didn't happen because they didn't get reported, i.e. fell asleep, drove off the road, but no damage?
What we believe is the greatest problem, the greatest difficulty in ascertaining the numbers of crashes, injuries, and deaths attributable to drowsy driving, even among crashes that are reported as crashes that happened, but aren't necessarily reported as having involved drowsy driving, is when an officer arrives at the scene of a crash several minutes after the crash has occurred, and a driver may seem wide awake, their adrenaline is pumping, they're all, for lack of a better way to put it, freaked out because they're cognizant that they had just been involved in a crash. Or at the other end of the spectrum, the driver may be incapacitated or deceased. Other than drawing some inferences from the factors present at the scene, for example, there's no evidence that the driver was intoxicated, but for whatever reason, the driver drove off the road without being forced off the road without another car. Other than sort of circumstantial factors like that, it's so extraordinarily difficult to ascertain what happened minutes ago that led up to the occurrence of the crash. There was actually a really nice study by the National Academies of Sciences in about 2005 or 6 or so, focused on drowsy driving crashes, that discusses this in a great deal of detail and likens the crashes that are reported as having involved drowsy driving to the tip of an iceberg.
I could probably add to that too. Again, you want to try and do as much background investigation with the operator to find out what you can, but not everyone will say that they were driving drowsy. And ultimately, there's still, and I think someone touched on this earlier, there's no kind of test to see if someone was drowsy while they were driving. So that kind of makes it difficult as well. I mean, you can probably infer based on your background that drowsiness probably played a factor in it, but again, that can also help with it being underreported.
And it's so, even if you do get to talk to the driver and ask them what happened, it's still so difficult. Even if they're not trying to hide anything from you, there's research not specific to driving showing that people really aren't that good at knowing how drowsy they are and how it's affecting them. There's research showing that if a person is just, again, outside the driving context, just left alone in a room and allowed to drift off to sleep, and then the researcher wakes them up, they have to be out for a good long while before they're more likely than not to realize upon the researcher waking them up that, yes, I was just asleep. And among another really important point that you raised as well is that it's not just falling asleep. Drowsiness also impairs your alertness and judgment in many other ways. In the sleep deprivation study that I likened to impairment associated with alcohol, those aren't all crashes involving people falling asleep. Among the people who slept the very least, less than 4 hours, yeah, most of them fell asleep. But among the crashes of people who had slept for 5 or 6 hours, they have the same kind of crashes that well-rested drivers have. They just have more of them, just from making mistakes that they'd be less likely to make if they were more alert. And these drivers likely to have no idea that fatigue played a role in the crash in the first place.
I would love to be able to jump in if it's okay. I think that that's partly our fault as panelists, not describing the difference between asleep at the wheel and drowsy driving at the beginning of our discussions, because most people, anecdotally, when I talk to them out on the rest stops, when my family's giving away coffee or giving away pamphlets, they all talk about someone they know that has fallen asleep at the wheel. And anecdotally, we know that those numbers are drastically different than the numbers that are being reported on, because everyone has a story. Everyone knows someone, but they do not understand that drowsy driving is different than asleep at the wheel, and that many of them, even if they don't have stories about being asleep at the wheel, are regularly driving drowsy.
That's so true. And hopefully they take it as a signal that they need to get more rest before driving, Jennifer. We have a question for Jim Nichols from Volvo. Are you still on track for no serious injuries beginning in 2020? No serious injuries or fatalities in a 2020 Volvo.
Sure. So, we've always, when we put out our vision and we put out a timeline for it was never kind of like a direct deadline of trying to hit that, but that's more of our vision of where we look to go. What we've seen is a dramatic decrease in the serious injuries and fatalities, but we still have some work to do, and that work that we need to do is in impairment, which includes both intoxication and what we're talking about here with drowsy driving, speed and distraction. So we've recently just starting this model year put new speed limiter for the top speed on it, and we're continuing to develop camera-based driver monitoring systems now, which will go into future cars. We still have these areas of driver error that, as we said before, technology can do a lot to try to mitigate those things. But there's areas of human behavior that require more awareness on the behalf of the driver in order to truly achieve those goals.
That's so true, and we wish you luck. It's certainly a tremendous goal, one which all of us in traffic safety would love to see you achieve. So I think we have time for one more question. Dan, do you want to give us the next one on the list?
Sure. To you, Judy. You talked a lot about teen drivers having issues, and Brian talked a lot about how young drivers are overrepresented in drowsy driving crashes. What can parents do to help with this issue?
Well, I think being aware of the risks is absolutely the first thing. And, as I mentioned in the example, parents are very vigilant about the association between alcohol consumption and driving. They need to be equally vigilant about the amount of sleep that their teen is getting. And, we coined this phrase, no Z's, no keys. That one of the few areas over which parents have control with their teenagers is not allowing them to drive when they're impaired. Now that poses a problem obviously when teens are driving themselves to and from school, but even the idea of taking a prophylactic nap in the afternoon, but with the heavy schedules that many of these adolescents have, and when school starts at 7 o'clock in the morning, these teens have to drive themselves at a time which for them it's like 3 o'clock in the morning for the rest of us. So imagine having to get up every day at 3 o'clock in the morning in the dark and drive yourself to work. And that's really what we're talking about here. So I think there's certainly an element of personal responsibility, and parents having frank discussions with their adolescents, helping them to organize their time so that they can get to sleep, but certainly on a broader level, advocating for school start time delay at the high school level is really one of the most critical issues that we face. And I hope that Massachusetts really steps up to the plate on this. California passed legislation last fall that mandates that all middle and high school start at 8:30 or later. And I'd like to see that happen in Massachusetts as well.
Judy, I know that's a dialogue and a conversation that will continue to unfold across the country as well as here in Massachusetts. I have to say this has been a great conversation. Sleep is such a complex issue. I feel like we could talk about this for another hour, but hopefully we have raised the level of awareness on drowsy driving through this great discussion that we've had. A big thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your expertise today. Thank you to Dan Goodman and to Pat Moody from our Northern New England Club for helping to organize and moderate. And a big shout out to Alex Slatke and Mark Shieldrop behind the scenes for all of their great work. We couldn't do it without the two of you. I want to give Alec a plug. Tune in tomorrow at 4 o'clock for the next installment in our AAA series on teen drivers. It's really been a great series so far, and tomorrow promises to be terrific and informative as well. And you can see our contact information there on the screen. Please email us for more information if you had a question that we did not have time to ask, and I know we did have some additional questions. Please email us and we will get those questions to our panelists. Finally, a big thank you to our audience. Thanks for participating in our poll. Stay safe on the road, stay awake and alert, stay cool, and have a great day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.